Okay, perfect. So the title I'll repeat: Entropy-based adaptive design for contour finding and estimating reliability. This is primarily the work of a former PhD student of mine named Austin Cole. And we collaborated with a team of material scientists at NASA. So I'll tell you about that application as we kind of get going a little bit, but it's ultimately a reliability application that weaves together surrogate modeling and uncertainty quantification and design of experiments. So I will tell you about that, and we'll warm up a little bit. So I work in computer simulation models. So many things these days, as computing has democratized exploration in science, we now write computer programs to study phenomena that would be very difficult to study physically. The examples come from all over science. You think about building things that you have one shot at that are going to be deployed far away in outer space. That's a good example. Parts of science that involve difficult apparatuses to study or explore. Examples come from fluid dynamics and from engineering buildings and studying how drugs interact with cardiovascular systems. So anything where it'd be difficult to build the apparatus or possibly unethical to experiment with the apparatus. Examples come from public health, like epidemiology. That's a hot subject at the moment. If you want to know whether a strategy like vaccination or maybe with animals culling would be sufficient in order to stamp out an epidemic, you don't want to just do it and try. You may not be allowed to do it and try, but it also is just not maybe a good idea. And instead, you might virtualize the system and entertain your intervention in that virtual system in order to figure out whether it has the desired effect. So I work in this area where systems are virtualized and they have configurations under which they can be studied. You could call those inputs if you want. And there's some interest in studying how outputs, which are emergent phenomena that are of interest to your scientific application, how those change as a function of the inputs. And there are many things you might want to do. You might want to optimize the system. You might want to understand its sensitivity to certain input configurations. And I'll show you about one in particular that we worked on with NASA as we get going further along in this talk. Any kind of experimentation is expensive, and this is true of physical experimentation and also computer experimentation. Computers are a lot less expensive to work with than physical systems are, but we still have the computational expense of evaluating this virtual world. These days, we're using supercomputers for this. We've got very complicated codes that are massively distributed and use a tremendous amount of computational power in order to explore whatever phenomenon we're hoping to simulate. So whenever the experiment is expensive, and I think the experiment is always expensive, it makes sense to build a model of the experiment. In this case, the experiment's a computer simulation, so it's already a model of something. And here I'm talking about like a meta model, a statistical model of how the computer experiment might behave. And that can help you with all sorts of enterprises with the computer code. It can help you design the experiment, to choose which input configurations to run your simulator at. It could help you with finding optimal conditions. It could help you with assessing uncertainty in which input parameters are having an effect on the response. So that could be called a sensitivity analysis. The idea is to insert a modeling apparatus that allows you to reason about many of the choices that you face as a modeler, in this case with the computer simulation model. So you could call this a statistical model, you could call it a regression, you could call it a meta model. In my world, we call it a surrogate model. The idea is we're building something cheap that sort of behaves similarly to the actual empirical observation of the computer code, that helps you make decisions about it and reason about the computer model, and helps you design an experiment that's appropriate for whatever you're trying to accomplish with the simulator. So I'm going to tell you about the framework that's most popular for surrogate modeling, but you don't need to choose this model for any of the things that we talk about in this talk, but I think it's a canonical choice, so it's worth introducing it. So the surrogate model that we use is called a Gaussian process. And the nice things about Gaussian distributions, or in our case, multivariate Gaussian distributions, is that there's a lot of analytical calculation that you can do with this distribution. So here we're using it as a regression, a nonlinear regression. We model our outputs of the computer simulation. So that's what I'm using Y for. The inputs to our computer simulation are X. And the covariance structure of this Gaussian involves the inputs X through a distance function. So here I've got e to the minus distance contributing to the covariance structure through a few other parameters, the details of which are not super important for this talk. So I think this is a really important trick to say that your outputs covary in the input space as a function of distance. So I have higher correlation between outputs whose inputs are closer together, and lower correlation for outputs whose inputs are farther apart in the input space. And this distance-based trick, through the covariance structure of a Gaussian distribution and through conditioning, introducing a new input X and studying how its Y value, which is unknown, varies as a function of distance to the training data, is really cool. You get a nice closed form equation. You can predict the mean of the outputs at a new input X prime as a function of its distance between its input configuration and the training data through a linear equation. So it's a linear equation, but it's a linear in distance, or an inverse distance between the training data locations and the testing data location. And the predictive uncertainty, or the variance, is a quadratic function of those distances. So a lot like linear regression, which is a very crude model for a computer simulation experiment that would study some complicated physical dynamics, where you get a linear predictive equation too. Here you get a linear predictive equation, but it's not in terms of the absolute inputs, but in terms of their distances in the input space, which gives you a nice nonlinear surface that can approximate many functions, including functions that arise as a function of computer simulation. So here's an example of that. Suppose my virtualization is being represented by a simple sine curve. So I have a computer experiment that when I choose its inputs, here the inputs are just in one dimension because the visuals are easy, and its outputs are just sine of X. But sine of X here is really just a stand-in for a computationally intensive computer simulation for the purposes of this visualization. So I've evaluated my computer model at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 locations. And I don't know it's a sine curve, but I'm interested in fitting a meta model or a surrogate to that, because I'd like to be able to do something with this computer model, but it's expensive to evaluate everywhere. And I want to replace it with something cheap. And that something cheap are the equations on the previous slide. This mean function and variance function are the cheap approximation to my sine of X. The blue dashed line is the mean function evaluated over a grid of potential X prime locations where I may want to study the output as a function of the inputs. And the red dashed line are error bars that are derived from that variance equation, 95% confidence interval on the prediction that comes from that sigma squared on the previous slide. And you can see this has a lot of attractive properties. The prediction is highly accurate. It's not perfect. We miss a little bit in this area where we don't have much data, but we have uncertainty attached with it that seems sensible. So I get good UQ. Even when I don't predict accurately, my variances tend to work out to capture what's going on in the data. So this is a Gaussian process surrogate fit to a very simple computer experiment. What might you do with this? Well, there are lots of things you could think that you'd want to do. Maybe you want to gather more computer model runs to tramp down this variance. Or maybe you want to do more computer model runs to figure out where the function is minimized. It's minimized over here. So those are two potential applications that the circuit could help you with. It could tell you where the function might be minimized and give you some uncertainty about that, or it could tell you where your variance is highest and give you some uncertainty about that, which might help you run new computer model runs to figure out more about what's going on in your system. So on the next slide, I have a kind of cartoon that, that characterizes this process. A lot of what I do in computer experiments is what is either called active learning or sequential design. The idea that you can build up an understanding of your system through a careful selection of the input configurations where the computer model is evaluated. So that's what the cartoon is here. You might start out with some smattering of points in the input space, and you obtain the responses there, and then you fit a meta model or a surrogate. I fit a Gaussian process, and then I use it to solve a decision problem. This decision problem is, where should I evaluate my computer model next? In the machine learning literature, they call these acquisition functions, but you can call it a design criteria or whatever. So I might be looking at minimizing predictive uncertainty, or I might look to find the minimum of the function. I have some decision, and that decision turns into an action, and that action is to run the computer model at a new location and augment my data. And hopefully, if I repeat this over and over again, I create a virtuous cycle between meta modeling and data acquisition in order to learn about the input-output dynamics of the system that I'm studying. Okay, I want to look at a few different of these acquisition functions on the next slide. So how you choose that depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to tramp down global uncertainty about the input-output relationship, then you might look at what's called integrated mean-squared prediction error, which just takes the variance function, which we have a closed form for, and integrates it over the input space. And it turns out that you can solve this integral in closed form if your sigma squared follows the equations that I put on the slide a few slides back. If they come from a Gaussian process, then you can do this integral in closed form. And then you have a decision criteria to help you select a new location where you might evaluate your computer code. Another one, if your goal is to find the minimum of the response surface, then you'd be doing what's called Bayesian optimization in the machine learning jargon. And a popular decision criteria or acquisition function for this enterprise is called expected improvement. And I'm caricaturing the formula for expected improvement as a kind of weighted combination of mean information and variance information. This is, again, something that you can calculate in closed form, and you can work out what these constants capital phi and little phi are. Like I said, I'm caricaturing it. I'm going to show you an example of expected improvement in just a minute. This talk is going to focus on something called entropy, which seeks to maximize the information gain about a discrete set of events. So if you have a discrete set of events, Wi, here there are k such events. If you can characterize what those events are, then a simple entropy calculation, again, it can be done in closed form in many situations, can help you decide how to maximize the information in your predictive distribution about those events. So I'm going to take a little tangent here and show you a little demonstration of expected improvement in this context, so you can get a sense for how we're going to do data collection using this active learning idea. But ultimately, my talk is going to be about the second one, about entropy. So we'll see two examples of this active learning idea over the course of today. So I'm going to go away from my slides for a minute to an R session. So let me know if you can't see this R session. And I'm going to source this code. We're not going to go through the code. The code is there. What I really want to focus on is the plots that show up here on the right. So here's a very similar situation to one that I introduced a few slides back. I've got a sinusoid that I've evaluated at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 locations. So I've got 6 black dots. So this represents my training data. This represents the information I have from simulation of this expensive computer model, which is really just a sinusoid. And I fit a Gaussian process to it And the black line is my mean function as a function of inputs x. And the red lines are my confidence interval for that prediction. And each one of the gray lines is actually a sample from the multivariate Gaussian describing my uncertainty. This isn't something that I have a formula for on the slides, but this is something you can calculate in closed form. So in some sense, each of the gray lines represents a plausible, according to this Gaussian distribution, according to the Gaussian process fit, a plausible function that represents my uncertainty about the training data. So you can kind of see how the functions have some variability with them that's being captured by a mean and a variance through the error bars. So this information about my fit, this information about my computer model, can be distilled down into a criteria that might help me choose a new location to evaluate my computer code if my goal is to minimize the function. So if my goal is to minimize the function, I can see that I kind of want to be in this area or maybe in this area, because some of my gray lines go pretty low in this area, although they're not very probable. And then also in this area here, some of my gray lines go pretty low. I don't need to sample in this area up here because my mean is very high and my uncertainty doesn't put me down below my current minimum. My current minimum is this guy right here. This is my smallest training data location. So that information is synthesized by this expected improvement criteria. It takes into account low means and high variances. So if I go back to the slides really quick, I see that low means are important and high variances are important, or this is standard deviation. So the expected improvement synthesizes it, and I've got a criteria now that I can optimize in order to make a selection about a new location to run my computer model at. And so this expected improvement surface is maximized here at about 4.5 or something like that. And the green dot represents that input configuration. It's the value of the output that I would get if I ran my computer code at that input. I don't know that yet. The surface doesn't take that into account. But when I press return and iterate and go to the next step, my Gaussian process will train on this point in addition to the other points and update its uncertainty about my unknown function, my unknown computer simulator. So I'm going to press return, and that's what it's going to do. It updates to take this new information into account, including all the previous information. This results in an update of my surrogate and an update in my expected improvement. So expected improvement is still sort of high in the vicinity of the place where I just took a point, but it's also high in other parts of the input space, which I haven't taken points for the same reason as before, because some of my uncertainty is down low, below where my current best location is. But I still choose to maximize this function, which takes an observation a little bit closer to 5, this green diamond. So I'm going to acquire data there and update. Now my uncertainty is very low in this part of the input space, and I explore a little bit more as a result. The expected improvement is highest now over here, and I'm going to acquire data there next, which is going to update my fit, which I go to. And now I see that I was right to be a little bit concerned that my function could be minimized here. So I want to take more data nearby, and I do. And I update my fit. But now I'm pretty confident that the function does not dip down below this part of the input space. So I'm done exploring here. And next I'm going to explore over here again, because there's some chance that my function goes low. I can see that it doesn't because the green diamond is up high. And when I condition on that, I start to have more confidence that I was exploring in the right region here in order to optimize the function. So as I continue, I'll step through this faster now. I get kind of reinforcing information that the minimum of the function is over here near 4.5 or close to 5. So that's a caricature, I guess, of how Bayesian optimization works. It's really just computer code coupled with a meta model, a surrogate, representing uncertainty about new computer model runs about this function that I'm modeling. And I get a criteria in closed form that helps me make decisions about where to sample next. towards this goal of finding the minimum in as few evaluations of the function as possible. And with some global perspective, you can see I've explored 2 or 3 different areas of the input space. It's not a local optimization. Okay, I'm going to go back to the slides now. That was my warm-up. Let me just say, if there are any questions, feel free to chime in. I don't know if chat will work because I might not see it, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
Yes, I have questions. Thank you. Till now, very interesting. So can you maybe give some intuition? What is better, to minimize KLD distance, or maybe some other distance, or maybe minimize entropy, or maybe minimize mean square error? Maybe it's somehow connected to distribution. I do not know.
I think I understand your question. So I guess I have 2 answers. One of them is we're really splitting hairs here. Anything that you do to acquire data about your computer model is going to provide you with a lot of information. So if your goal is to minimize the surface, but you don't choose the right statistic for that, you choose a different one, like you choose to minimize variance, I think you're still going to do a really good job of optimizing the function, because you're going to get global information and eventually you're going to learn where the minimum of your surface is. You may not learn as efficiently as if you make exactly the right choice for your goal, but I think you're going to do well. The second prong to my answer is, if you really know what you want, like you want to minimize the function and you're not caring about your computer simulation for all inputs, you only care about the inputs that give you a low value of the output, then you can design an appropriate acquisition function that lets you make that decision efficiently, if you know exactly what you want, and if you can do the calculations that make it tractable to choose amongst alternatives in that setting. So I guess what I'm saying is, I've given you 3 options here, and I've shown you an example with one, and I'm going to show you an example with another in a minute. But in some sense, it doesn't matter too much what you do, because I think you're going to do well in a variety of situations. But you can always do better by tailoring things to the degree that you feel comfortable.
Well, thank you. And second half of the same question, from numerical point of view, assuming that we have high dimensional densities or high dimensional random variables, what is the easiest to compute?
In high dimension, I'll show you some higher dimensional examples later, although what's high to me may not be high to you. I think the challenges do increase. You can still calculate, no part of the equations here that cover what the surrogate is doing has anything to do with the dimension of the inputs. It may have something to do with the dimension of the outputs, although my focus for this talk is on a one-dimensional output. What really matters is the dimension of the number of runs. You have to decompose big matrices potentially if you have many training data examples, and that can become prohibitive, which is a literature in and of itself. And when you're searching this response surface, if you're trying to do like our example here and find the part of the input space that has high expected improvement, you may have a big job to comb that input space in high dimensions to find the parts of it that give promising values of the acquisition function. That's not always an easy problem, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do that more for a different example today. So maybe I'll ask you to delay for a second that question to see if I answer it later in the talk.
Thank you very much.
Sure. All right, thanks very much for those questions. Feel free to ask more as we go. So now I want to transition a little bit and tell you about the problem that we want to solve. So I'm working with material scientists at NASA, and one of the things that they are studying is the next generation of spacesuits that astronauts will wear, I guess ultimately on Mars, but I think for the simulations that they were entertaining, it was for the moon or for the International Space Station, because I guess those are more tangible at this time. So they want to build a new spacesuit, and of course, they're interested in making it robust. They don't want it to fail. They don't want tears in the spacesuit. They want, if there's an impact on the moon, like the astronaut trips, and falls, or if they're on the space station, International Space Station, and they're hit by space debris or something like that, they don't want it to tear. So they're interested in a reliability problem, but they're also interested in an optimization problem. They want the astronaut to be mobile, to be able to move freely, and they want to accommodate all sorts of other things. So they have virtualized this system. They have to virtualize the system, right? They can build these things, but they can't explore how they behave in outer space, except if they're in outer space, which is, of course, a very expensive experiment to do. And there's a chicken or egg problem there. How do you experiment in space with spacesuits that are good enough for space until you've taken them out into space? So they virtualize this system, and they can explore how different designs of this spacesuit behave under extreme conditions or under regular conditions. But this study is focused on extreme conditions. So here's the mathematical problem. They've got some situations. So the variables x correspond to things that could happen in outer space. So maybe this is tripping and falling from certain heights and landing on the surface of the moon, or maybe it's a projectile of space debris that hits them while they're working on the International Space Station. So those are our inputs to the code, and they have some distribution, right? These bad things that can happen don't happen all the time. They're just a subset of the total distribution of things that could happen. And their objective with these inputs is to study the probability of some, Y here is basically a force. If a force exceeds a certain threshold under these inputs, then there's a failure, like a tear in the spacesuit, and those things happen with some probability alpha. And they're interested in understanding this distribution, the probability of failure under the input distribution X. So they virtualize this system. They've got the spacesuit in space, and they've got the conditions that they happen, and they, for particular values of the input, can study whether or not the force, or what the force is, and whether or not it exceeds a certain threshold. So that's kind of the setup of the experiment. Here's some more details of the computer experiment in terms of quantities. So first of all, here's a schematic of this is just part of the spacesuit. This is the upper torso of the spacesuit as a schematic diagram that would be input into their computer code. And then the bad things that can happen is another variable, and that variable, depending on the situation that they're studying, might be 2-dimensional or might be 10-dimensional. And they've figured out that as a function of these inputs, there are multiple regions in the input space. So in the space in 10 dimensions, say, of this X, there are multiple different disjoint areas where failures can occur. And they're interested in estimating the contours in this input space that correspond to high and low quantiles of extreme thresholds or probabilities of failures. That's the whole idea of the experiment, is to make these failure regions as small as possible, to make it very unlikely that the spacesuit will fail. So there's an inherent extremeness to this simulation. It's going to be very hard to find regions of the input space, if they're doing a good job, where the spacesuit fails. And they want to be conservative about the estimates of those failure regions so that there's some built-in robustness. And finally, well, this is a detail I won't talk much about. There's an interest in running the computer experiments on massively distributed or parallelized supercomputer. So when they choose runs, they want to choose them in batches so they can run on multiple nodes of a computer experiment at a time, which is a nuance when it comes to design that's a little bit tricky, and not one that I'll talk a lot about today, except to mention that the ideas that we're working with help them to do that, to do batch selection so they can do multiple runs of the computer code at once. All right, so that's the setup. How could you do an experiment like this? So you're thinking about understanding variability in forces on the upper torso of a spacesuit. Here's some things you could do. One thing you could do is just draw inputs randomly. You have some distribution on these input configurations, and you could just take 1,000 X's according to their distribution of things that could happen, and you could run the simulator at each of those, and then you could just count the number of times that that one of these X's led to a failure, and the number of times that didn't. and then you would have an estimate of your probability of failure. And that would be very computationally intensive because the parts of the input space that lead to a failure are small because they've worked hard. They've developed their upper torso to minimize failures. So the next thing that you could think of doing is to change the distribution. Although you're interested in F, but that leads to very low probability of failure, you could choose a different F that was biased towards the failure regions, and then draw your X's from it instead, and then correct your probability estimates according to that biasing distribution and according to the original distribution that you wanted to calculate your probability from. So that's the idea of importance sampling. If you've not heard of it, then I'm not doing enough justice to explain what it is, but it's just this idea that you can make things a little bit easier to get a more accurate estimate of a probability through simple averaging. In this case, you do a simple weighted average. The trouble with doing importance sampling in this context is that you might not know what a good biasing distribution is because you don't necessarily know what parts of the input space lead to failures. So the third idea here is to try to track that, to use a surrogate like a Gaussian process, like I just showed you, to help you construct a biasing distribution. And how that would go, we didn't think of this. This is called multi-fidelity importance sampling. It's a great idea that came out a few years back. And it says just run an initial experiment where maybe you space fill with inputs X in your input space, and you fit a Gaussian process to the inputs and outputs. And then you use that to identify promising parts of the input space that would lead to failure. It's always awkward to say that failing is good, but in this context of the computer experiment, we're interested in creating failures, so it's good for us. So we find a distribution that would create failures from this initial experiment, and then we use it to do importance sampling. And that's the idea of multi-fidelity importance sampling. What this talk is about is the last idea, which I think is kind of a new one, is to use this sequential idea, this active learning idea, to adaptively design a computer. Oops, I went ahead on accident. To adaptively design an experiment that focuses on the boundary between failure and non-failure. If you can focus your computer experiment on those boundaries, which is essentially finding a level set or finding a contour in your response surface, then that will allow you to generate a better F star and get better importance samples. Okay, so that's the contribution in this talk. So we're hinting at an acquisition function, one that would target a contour, that would target the boundary between failure and non-failure, and that would help us develop a distribution that will give us more accurate estimates of the probability of failure for this spacesuit under the input distribution of interest. Okay, so I want to augment my cartoon here. This is the same cartoon in the middle here as we had before, but I've replaced it with something called ECL, which I'm going to introduce on the next slide. So this is my acquisition criteria. So I'm going to try to create a virtuous cycle that tells me where the contour is between failure and non-failure. So I can use that downstream to fit a biasing distribution F star that'll give me accurate importance sampling estimates of my reliability goal. Okay. The idea of optimizing data acquisition for finding a contour is not in itself new. There are three ideas here, and the three ideas focus on the three different criteria that I had on the slide a moment ago. So Alexander asked, how do I choose between these methods? And my answer to him was, well, any of them would work okay. And that's true because people have written about using these three criteria for this goal of doing it wasn't to do importance sampling, but it was to find contours. And they all work reasonably well. But when we studied them, we found that they had an implicit bias on non-extreme quantiles. So the text here says, but none focused on extreme quantiles because that short phrase fit well on the slide. But it's better to say that they had an implicit bias towards easy to find level sets. And the level sets that we're looking for are extreme because the NASA engineers have done a good job of building their spacesuit so that it's robust, meaning the parts of the input space that lead to failure are very small. And so we found that they didn't work well, or they didn't work as well as they could work for focusing on extreme quantiles. So we changed things up a little bit. Another thing is that they were very slow. They were very computationally intensive to evaluate in order to make choices, but that was a secondary concern for us. All right, I want to tell you about the acquisition function that we used. It was based on entropy. And remember, the entropy formula was about an entropy calculation over sets. And we're using a very simple set of sets. There are only two, and which means that one is the complement of the other. So set one was that the response exceeds the threshold, so it results in a failure. And set two, or event two, is that the response does not exceed the threshold. It does not result in a failure. So we've created a bifurcation of the input space into failure and non-failure to define our events and thereby define our entropy. And it turns out that with these sets, you can calculate entropy in closed form. So really that's what I'm showing in this big formula is the evaluation of this sum using a Gaussian process prediction for my y variables. So I'm really just synthesizing the mean and the variance, which is what I get from my surrogate, into an entropy calculation, which can be done in closed form. And in this case, the capital phi is the cumulative distribution function of a Gaussian distribution, or the error function, if you will, of a Gaussian distribution. So I can evaluate entropy in closed form, and we've called that ECL for entropy-based contour locator. So we're looking for the contour. We're looking for equality, right? We want to know where y of x is equal to t, and we create two different sets, greater than and less than, in order to use entropy to target the contour itself. And that's why we call this entropy-based contour locator, or ECL. And we have an extension to this that allows us to choose a batch. But again, I didn't want to talk about that in any detail. So I want to demonstrate this idea for you a few different ways. Here's one way. So suppose, think about the sinusoid example that we had before, but in fact, this is not the sinusoid data. It's different data. But so suppose I have a prediction in blue of what my response surface looks like. And I have uncertainty in that prediction. That's the red line. So this represents my surrogate. I have some prediction and I have some uncertainty associated with it. And suppose I'm interested in the contour at 0. So this represents kind of an extreme contour. Above it is failure, below it is non-failure. And I want to find the parts of the input space where my function might be crossing that contour. So here I can see that my mean prediction does cross the contour. And other places, the mean prediction does not cross the contour, but my uncertainty does cross the contour in two places. So there are like three parts of the input space, here, here, and here, that represent promising locations for targeting the level set of y equals 0. And it represents an extreme contour because most of the response surface is below that contour. The green line is this ECL, just to kind of visually show you that it synthesizes the information in a sensible way. The green line is highest when the mean and the variance put us around the contour location. It's sort of medium when just the variance covers the contour location. And it's higher again where both things are close to the location. So it's synthesizing mean and variance in a way that's very similar to expected improvement, which was for optimization, but now this is for contour finding instead of for optimization. All right, so that's a very simple example in 1D. One thing you might notice from that very simple example is that the ECL surface might have disconnected regions. In fact, in higher dimension, it's going to have ridges of global optima depending on the nature of the predictive surface. So let's go back. This is just saying that this green surface is multimodal. And this is true in expected improvement as well. You probably remember seeing that the expected improvement surface was multimodal. So somehow we're going to need an optimization strategy to find the peaks in this region and explore locally in those peaks. And in fact, in higher dimension, this is harder to visualize, although I'll have one coming up in 2D in a moment. In fact, you're going to have whole ridges of the input space where the expected contour located criteria is high. So we're going to need a method for exploring nearby local maxima and for spreading out a little bit, for finding parts of the input space that prefer exploitation. This is something that was brought up by previous methods, those 3 papers that I cited before, and they solved this problem by introducing extra integrals to average information a little bit more. But we found that this is very difficult. This numerical integration is hard. So we've solved this diversity problem by taking a 2-pronged approach. One prong is just to put some input locations in the input space. We use Latin hypercubes that are kind of small, 10 times d in d input dimensions. And we evaluate our criteria at that discrete set, and then choose one of the points to initialize a local optimization to find a precise location that optimizes the function. So Alex was asking a little bit about this, I think. He was saying, how do we finally select in a high dimensional space, say, the next acquisition point? And this is our strategy for doing that. So we pepper the input space with a few locations and find a promising one. And then we do a local optimization nearby that promising one in order to settle on our final location. And I'm going to illustrate this to you for an example, with an example here. So this is my slightly higher dimensional example to kind of show you what's going on. It's hard to visualize in 6 or 7 input dimensions, easier to visualize in 2 input dimensions. So here's my 2 input dimension visual. What are we looking at here? So this surface is my ECL surface. So red represents not promising areas to search for a contour. Yellow represents promising areas to search for a contour. So this is based on a Gaussian process fit, which I'm not showing you. I'm just showing you the ECL surface that's implied by that Gaussian process fit. And the grayish or blackish line here is the true contour, but I don't know what the true contour is. I just have an estimate for what it is. And I have an acquisition criteria that summarizes where I would sample next in order to learn about what their contour is. So what you might see from this plot is that there is a large region of the input space that represents promising locations for finding the contour. I could basically sample anywhere in the yellow. And I don't even really need to optimize the yellow. I'll probably get lots of information if I take anywhere in this yellow area about where the contour is. And if I take a point in this red area, I'm going to get a lot less information. So that's fine. It means I have some flexibility when it comes to choosing the location. But at the end of the day, I need to choose one particular location. So I need a strategy for that. So here's how I do it. I'm going to take, by the way, the black dots are my training data sites that have gone into to estimating my response surface and to ultimately developing this search area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to smatter the input space with some locations. These are my Latin hypercube samples. So this is where I'm going to evaluate my criteria. So although I can see this whole surface here, that my algorithm doesn't see the whole surface. It only sees the criteria evaluated at the blue open circles. And one of those blue open circles has the largest value of the response of the ECL. And that's the one that's green here. So the green one is the most yellow. So it's the one that's in the most yellow part of the input space. And then I'm going to take that location and do a local optimization to find the very most yellow part nearby my green circle. So that's the next thing. The very most yellow part nearby the green circle is where the X is. So that's my newly selected point. I'm going to acquire the Y value. I'm going to run my computer model at that location and then update my response surface and update my decision criteria, my ECL. So that's the next slide. I've acquired the point there. That's changed my response surface a little bit. Now I'm showing you the estimated contour. This is my mean contour overlaying the truth. You can see I don't have it perfectly, but I've only acquired one new point. If I repeat the process, now I'm not showing you both the peppering set and the optimization, just its final outcome. The next selection is going to be here at the X. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I acquired data there. I learned that the contour is nowhere near that location. and I repeat. The next location to choose is that one. So I take that one, and then the next location to choose is this one. So I take that one. And you can see that although I'm not always accurate about where I'm sampling as far as where the contour is, it is giving me a lot of information about the response surface, and that information is getting collated into where I believe the contour is. So I now have very low uncertainty about where this contour is. And although I can certainly take more data, and I do here, to choose the next one, I don't even have a next slide. You can see that I'm already pretty accurate about where my contour is. Okay, so that's basically the idea. Now I want to show you that. Now I can't do as much as sort of like illustration in higher dimension, but I want to show you that we worked on this in higher dimensional problems. So here's two benchmark exercises. You could Google the Ishigami function and the Hartmann-6 function. They're functions in 3 input dimensions and 6 input dimensions respectively. And I'm not interested in learning those entire functions. I want to define a challenging contour to explore for these guys. So I've chosen a failure threshold for these two functions that result in a number of failure regions. So in the Ishigami, there are 6 regions that are above that threshold. And in the Hartmann function, there are 2. And those correspond to quantiles in an input distribution that are very extreme. So these are very small regions of the input space. And I've designed an experiment where in one case, I started with 30 points and grew my experiment to 170. And in the other case, in higher dimension, you need more points to find out what's going on. So I start with 60 and grow to 440. And these are the resulting failure probabilities that I've estimated from that. And then I could also do some multi-fidelity importance sampling, but in fact, I'm not showing you that part of the experiment here today. Oh, so finally, what am I going to measure? How am I going to tell that I'm doing a good job? I'm going to measure 2 statistics as I grow my experiment from 30 to 170 and 60 to 440. So I'm going to measure how often I correctly predict failure in the input space. So I want that to be high. I want my probability of correctly predicting failure to be high. And I'm also going to measure the volume error of what I predict my failure region to be. So this is my estimated failure region compared to the true failure region. And I want that difference to be low. So the first statistic I want to be high and the second statistic I want to be low. And here I'm going to run an experiment with, here I'll do Ishigami first. So that's the 3-dimensional problem. Our methods are the top 2. The blue one is the one I explained to you. The dashed blue one, I didn't. It's the batch version that works very similarly. And these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other methods based on those 3 papers that I cited that do some variation of the other statistics. And they also, some of them also do pretty well, but we think not as well as our method. So our method is getting sensitivity better, higher is better, although some of the methods eventually catch up as we, keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry about that. Some of the other methods catch up, others of the other methods don't. So this is over all the evaluations, and the final plot is showing a distribution of evaluations at the final time step. So you can see in a Monte Carlo study how repeatable these methods are. So we are competitive with the best methods on sensitivity. On volume error, again, this time you want low, lower is better. Our method is on average the lowest and is competitive with some of the other methods on that criteria. So that's Ishigami. The Hartmann, the 6-dimensional function, our method is again the best and uniformly dominates the other methods, I would say, both in terms of mean accuracy and in terms of variability in the Monte Carlo exercise. We get much more consistently favorable sensitivity results. And in terms of volume error, again, ours stands out. It's the very best method compared to all of the other ones. Maybe the most important table from an implementation perspective is this one that's time, computation time to make decisions. Our method is by far faster in terms of exploring the input space in computation time, which may not be a factor depending on what you're doing, but we find that it's helpful to have a very quick turnaround compared to some of the other methods in terms of computation time. These numbers are in seconds. All right, so we get good exploration of the contours. That wasn't exactly what we wanted. We wanted to know where the contours were so that we could do multi-fidelity importance sampling. So I want to show you the multi-fidelity importance sampling results for these toy problems where we know what the truth is. And then I'll show you what we did on the NASA experiment to wrap things up. So these failure probabilities that we were targeting, we got very accurate. We're just focused on the black. So this is our method right here. The black method is getting a very accurate estimate of the failure probability after doing the expected contour location experiment. If we compare this to just doing a simple space filling of the input space, that's what's represented by Latin hypercube sampling here, we get a very poor estimate of the failure probability. We miss by quite a lot because we don't get enough data near that contour. The black here that I'm showing you, same thing for the Hartmann function, very accurate for us, very inaccurate for the simple method. That was the plot in our original submission of this paper, but the referees came back and said, well, why don't you do this other thing? Why don't you use the upper confidence bound of your surrogate, fit to your Latin hypercube and to your ECL and try that instead. And so we said, okay, we'll do that. We get about the same results as for our method if we do those, and we get slightly better results for the straw man, but still nowhere near as good. We don't get as tight or as accurate estimate of the failure probability. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this alternative method. It's not a bad idea, but it still doesn't quite work for what we're after. All right, let me wrap up with the NASA experiment. Now, we don't know what the truth is, so it's harder to make some comparisons, but I want to illustrate to you that our method is doing something interesting and is probably giving more accurate results. So here's the doing something interesting. It's a 6-dimensional data set, and it's hard to show you what's going on in 6 dimensions. So I'm going to show you projections of pairs of 2 of the inputs. So input 1 and input 2 and input 3, input 4 and input 4 and 6, I think. I can't remember which input numbers they are. If we do vanilla Monte Carlo, so just random sampling, that's what's represented by the green cloud. If we first do a simple LHS and then do multi-fidelity sampling, that's the orange cloud. If we do our method, which finds the contours, then that's the blue cloud. So I think maybe I like this view the best. The blue cloud is really focusing in on a particular part of the input space for these 2 coefficients, and also for this one, really focusing in on a particular part of the input space for these 2 input coefficients. There's no focus at all from the original Monte Carlo, and there's a weaker focus for the simple straw man. And it's different for this plot, especially compared to this plot. So we're really focusing on different parts of the input space by first targeting a contour through active learning and then doing the importance sampling idea. And how does that pay off? Well, here's the plot of how that pays off. So the Monte Carlo method is getting very few failures. That's the red bar here, the number of failures or the proportion of failures. Pure Monte Carlo gets very few failures. The simple method based on just peppering the input space and fitting a single Gaussian process gets more failures, but it doesn't much change the estimate of the failure probability. So the estimates here are about the same. And it's kind of interesting that the error bars are wider for the estimate of the failure probability under the naive method. We are getting many more failures compared to both methods, and it changes our estimate of the failure probability. Although notice that this black square is in the intervals of the first 2, but now we get a much narrower confidence region, well, narrower in one direction and extends further into a new area in another dimension. So we think that this means that we've got a better estimate. And of course, we don't know because we don't know what the truth is, but we're encouraged by these results. All right, so the final summary slide, I think I've come in under time. Using a surrogate model with importance sampling provides a cheaper approach to failure probability estimation for expensive simulators. Adaptive design with an appropriate heuristic seems to do a good job of targeting the contours and gives an even more accurate bias distribution for importance sampling. Carefully optimized criteria that we chose this expected contour locator seems to appropriately balance exploration and exploitation to drive down contour uncertainty. And consequently, we get adaptive designs that are much faster because we have a very simple criteria. And we can also work in batch if needed. Everything that I've shown you code-wise is available on our in our GitHub. It's a Bitbucket Git repository. So you can reproduce all of these results, although you cannot run new NASA simulator codes. They wouldn't let us release the simulator, but you can see the data that we worked with and the toy problems and re-engineer all these results. So thanks very much. I want to end with a plug, if you'll allow me to do that, and share a different browser window. I've written a book on surrogate modeling that explains, it doesn't have this problem in it because this problem is newer than any of that work, but explains my approach to surrogate modeling. For example, if you wanted to learn about Gaussian process regression, you could pull up chapter 5 here. So the book is free. You can view it electronically on my webpage, or you can buy a copy of it from Chapman and Hall. I definitely would appreciate it if you bought one, but if you wanted to just see how I do Gaussian process regression, you could kind of scroll through it. So I hope that'd be a valuable resource if that's of interest. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'll end there.